Shadow of the Colossus, a game that's often considered one of the most noteworthy titles in the PlayStation 2's massive library. It was originally released in 2005 as a PS2 exclusive, developed by Sony and Team Ico, who had previously made the PS2 cult classic, well, Ico, which Shadow of the Colossus serves as a sort of spiritual successor to. The game was met with critical acclaim worldwide, being called not just one of the greatest games of all time, but one of the most influential titles of that generation, as it helped pave the way for more games that focused on deep narratives and immersion, and it's often one of the first examples used in the "can video games be considered art" debate. And then there's me. I've made it clear in the past that I didn't like the original Shadow of the Colossus. Granted, there were some things I liked about it, but overall, I couldn't get into it. Though despite this, I was admittedly pretty excited when at E3 2017, Sony announced that Shadow of the Colossus was going to be getting a remake. Not a remaster like the PS3 version, a full-fledged, from-the-ground-up remake on PS4, to be developed by Bluepoint Games. While in hindsight, I shouldn't have had a reason to be excited, the potential for fixing up many of the elements I didn't like about the original were there, and to be fair, I last played this game in, 2013. A lot can change about one's mindset in 5 years. Granted, I've never been one for overly artsy games in general. I'm just a simple-minded fellow who likes to play games for the funsies, so there's a chance I could be setting myself up for failure right out the gate, but hey, it's like they say, there's an exception to every rule. So I picked up the game a few weeks after its release, which coincidentally was February 6th, the date of my birthday, though part of me likes to think that wasn't a coincidence, and, well, here I am now to talk about how I felt. So without any further delays, let's get this show on the road. So the game opens with our story's protagonist, Wander, traversing mountainsides and forests on his horse, whose name seems to have slipped my mind.
Agro!
I'm sure I'll remember it later. His journeying takes him into this vast region known as the Forbidden Lands, where he comes across a large shrine. He takes what he's been carrying with him, which happens to be a person, and places her at the altar. While looking over the girl's body, Wander is attacked by a bunch of strange shadow creatures, but he defeats them with the power of his magic glowy sword. This gets the attention of Dorman, a spirit currently residing in the ceiling, and this is when things start to get a bit clearer. The girl, whose name is Mono, had been sacrificed for, as the game puts it, having a cursed fate, and in response, Wander stole the magic glowy sword and took Mono's body to the Forbidden Lands in search for Dorman. For legend has it, Dorman has the power to revive the dead. Dorman confirms this and decides to make a deal with Wander. If he successfully defeats the mighty Colossi roaming the Forbidden Lands, which in turn would destroy the giant statues in the shrine, Dorman will bring Mono back to life. And with practically no hesitation, Wander agrees to the deal. He doesn't even bat an eye when Dorman warns Wander the price he'll have to pay. And for most of the game, that's all you get for story. You want to bring this girl back to life, and you gotta kill some Colossi to do it. Pretty straightforward. Though things aren't quite as they seem. Most notably with how after each Colossus defeat, a black mist escapes the Colossus' corpse and strikes Wander, making him fall unconscious before reappearing in the shrine. Adding on to that, once you've killed the 12th Colossus out of 16, the game decides to rather abruptly introduce a new character in the form of this masked priest-looking guy named Lord Emon. While never confirmed, it's presumed that he and his group are the ones who had sacrificed Mono in the first place, with Emon and his soldiers pursuing Wander to the Forbidden Lands after Wander stole the magic glowy sword. I'll go into Emon's purpose in the story shortly, but it did feel weird to suddenly have another character enter the story so late into the game. Anyway, when there's one Colossus left, Dorman warns Wander that Emon's on his way to stop them, so he best hurry and kill the last Colossus. But as he and his horse make their way across a canyon, the bridge they're crossing begins to collapse, and to save his life, Wander is flung off to the other side of the canyon by his horse, while his dear companion falls to her death into the canyon river below. Still can't seem to remember her name though. It's on the tip of my tongue. Following the defeat of the last Colossus, we see Emon and his soldiers have finally arrived at the shrine, and they witness the last statue's destruction. As Emon says a prayer over Mono's body, Wander reappears in the shrine, though he definitely looks like he's seen better days. Turns out, the Colossi each contained a fragment of Dorman's split-apart soul, and with each Colossus death, said fragment entered Wander's body, so he's essentially got almost all of Dorman's soul contained inside of him. Realizing that Dorman's using Wander to resurrect himself, Emon quickly has his soldiers put Wander out of his misery, and Wander uses his last moments to desperately try to get to Mono, who's still dead by the way. But unfortunately, Wander drops dead, and Dorman leaves the ceiling to join with the rest of their soul in Wander's body, the resurrection now complete. But this return is short-lived as Emon and his soldiers flee the scene, with Emon throwing the magic glowy sword into this pool, which opens up a vortex to re-imprison Dorman. Now at this point, you're given player input, and you as a shadowy Wander are supposed to resist the pull of the vortex in a desperate attempt to still get to Mono, but you'll inevitably be sucked into the vortex. And then there's me. With Dorman sealed away, the bridge to the shrine begins to collapse, preventing access to it from outside of the Forbidden Lands. But surprisingly, Dorman kept his end of the bargain, as Mono actually is revived, though she seems rather unfazed by her new surroundings. So she begins to leave the shrine when, what? Game. Are you seriously trying to tell me that Aggro took a fall that drastic and only came out with a broken leg? Actually, now that I think about it, how did she even make it back? She was at the bottom of a canyon with a broken leg. Whatever, maybe it was another magic Dorman miracle. And as the two start to leave the shrine, they find that Wander and Dorman have been reborn in the form of a horned baby. And Aggro seems pretty unimpressed by this. She looks at the baby and then just turns away to leave. I do like the ideas that Shadow the Colossus brings to the table with how it handles its narrative. At the start, you might have questions about Mono's cursed fate, or if she and Wander had a history, or if Wander just found her really pretty and wanted to bring her back to life in hopes that she would love him, but the game doesn't make a big deal about it, so in turn, neither should you. Until Emon shows up. Emon's presence, in my opinion, contradicts a lot with how Shadow the Colossus handles its narrative. The game's story overall had an aura of mystery that, from the looks of it, wasn't going to answer your questions simply because answering those questions wasn't important. But with Emon abruptly entering the story, a portion of the mystery is solved, which leaves you in an awkward spot where you simultaneously have too little information and too much information. I get that he was probably included as a way to defeat Dorman once the resurrection was complete, but not only does that make him a living plot device, but to introduce a new character and then make him a major character in the last 15 or so minutes of the game, well, it didn't sit well with me. And because of that, what should have been an emotionally gripping ending didn't resonate with me in the slightest. If I may, what I would have done was have Dorman begin to possess Wander after the last Colossus had been destroyed, and in his last moments of having control, Wander opens the vortex himself, leaving the now resurrected Dorman helpless. That way, Wander still suffers consequences for killing the Colossi, but also allows him to use his last moments to take responsibility for his selfish mistake and seal away Dorman, knowing that it would most likely cost him his own life. I don't know, that's probably how I do it, but that's just me. Now, as for the characters, they don't have much to write home about, honestly. We know Wander has some sort of liking for Mono to want to go through all this trouble to resurrect her. Mono's dead for almost the entire game. Aggro's just a horse. Emon comes off as a highly religious figure, and Dorman might as well be the devil. Manipulative, cunning, all-powerful, gets his butt handed to him, among other things. Though again, with how Shadow the Colossus initially handles its narrative, the game doesn't really have a reason to further elaborate on these characters. Until the ending, that is, but I think I've said all I want to say in this regard. Now, if I can sidetrack a little bit, I'd like to briefly talk about the presentation from the PS2 version of Shadow the Colossus. Given the PS4 version is a remake, having the original as a means of comparison would be fitting. The original game certainly had a very impressive sense of scale, between the massive overworld and the enormous beasts that are the Colossi. That said, given it was a game from 2005 aiming for a realistic visual style, it has certainly begun to show its age. And if I can be honest, the original game had abysmal lighting. The dark corridors tended to be hard to navigate due to how impossible it was to see in them, and areas like the desert wasteland where you fight phalanx is blindingly bright. And with that said, let's move back to the remake. The PS4 version keeps that sense of scale, but Bluepoint Games has taken full advantage of the technological advances we've had between the PS2 and the PS4. In other words, this game is absolutely beautiful. Given how much we see hyper-realistic looking games nowadays, I probably shouldn't be as blown away by something that is relatively common in the gaming industry, but I think it's this level of detail combined with the game's level of scale that makes it so impressive. The opening cutscene in particular perfectly captures the scale and beauty of this game. I almost never skipped the opening whenever I booted the game up for footage recording. It was that wonderful. The lighting's also a lot better. You can actually see in dark corridors now, and there's never a moment of the game where it's overly bright like in the original. The Colossi also look absolutely awe-inspiring in this remake. The level of detail on their bodies is incredible, and the glow that comes from their eyes is genuinely fear-inducing. Like, look at Dirge here. It looks like he has a black hole in his eyes. It's both creepy, but also kind of mesmerizing. Though if I had to pick a favorite part of this game in regards to its visuals, I'd have to go with the battle against the final Colossus, Malice. Not only is the scale of this boss insane, but the rain effects are just so well done. The way it appears on the ground when a flash of lightning lights the sky, and you can even see it run down surfaces and watch drips fall from the ceiling. The level of detail in this game is truly amazing. Now, I've noticed that a lot of the time in remakes, the soundtrack is generally either remastered or recomposed, but here, the soundtrack, from the sounds of it, has remained untouched from the original, which is perfectly fine by me because the soundtrack may actually be my favorite thing about the game. The game was composed by Ku Otani, and man, I kinda wish he did more video game soundtracks, because his pieces are filled to the brim with atmosphere. Each piece perfectly fits the role it's been given, with calm but dark music for whenever Dorman's around, or when you found a Colossus who's minding its own business and the music starts to slowly build up tension, but still keeping it relatively quiet, and once you have the Colossus's attention, the music just ramps up and your ears are treated to an intense but wonderful melody. There's plenty of amazing songs in this soundtrack, but my favorite is definitely A Despair-Filled Farewell, and I think it perfectly captures what I was saying about the Colossus battle themes. Now with that said, let's get to the technical stuff. Once again, to draw comparisons, the original game ran usually at around 20 frames per second, but from personal experience, it did have some notable dips into the mid-teens. However, the remake runs at 30 frames per second on a regular PS4 and 60 frames per second on a PS4 Pro. I played the game entirely on a regular PS4, and not only did the jump to 30 FPS make the game generally feel better to play, but not once did I experience any noticeable frame drops. That said, what it lacks in frame rate issues, it makes up for in glitches. I didn't have too many instances of glitches during my playthrough, but the glitches I did run into were, interesting. Aw, look, it's wagging its tail. Now, gameplay-wise, Shadow of the Colossus is rather unique for a game of its kind. It's part of that vague action-adventure genre, and if I had to compare it to anything at a base level, I'd go with The Legend of Zelda. However, like I said, that's only at base level, because while games like Zelda provide you with dungeons to explore and key items to get and side quests to do, Shadow of the Colossus has two key gameplay aspects: finding the next Colossus and killing said Colossus. Shadow of the Colossus is essentially a boss rush game, just with having to traverse the overworld in between each boss fight. With this in mind, I could absolutely understand why someone would find this too repetitive or boring. In fact, I thought that when playing the original. But this time around, I did find myself enjoying the exploration parts more than before. Not to say they were fun per se, you're just riding your horse to your next destination and then climbing around or swing for a bit, but I wasn't feeling totally bored like I used to feel. The breathtaking environments could play a part in that, I don't know. I admittedly even stopped a few times to play around with the remake's new snapshot feature and get a nice shot of the environment. Actually, on that note, can I just say that I really like this camera feature that a lot of modern games are incorporating? I don't know, it's just fun to get different angles of a single shot or to apply a filter to make it that much more interesting. Control-wise, the Shadow of the Colossus remake actually does something pretty ingenious. See, despite the original's critical acclaim, many as of late have come out and mentioned how the control scheme was a bit awkward. And yeah, I'm one of those people. The controls did feel awkward in the original. Fortunately, Blue Point Games thought of those players, but also thought of those who liked the original controls, and thus have provided the option to choose your control scheme, one based on how it was in the original, and a brand new button layout. This was probably the best way this could have been handled, providing an option for both sides of the spectrum. I used the new control scheme for my entire playthrough of the game, and for me at least, it felt a lot better to control. Now actually, the thing I said earlier about there only being two things you can do with this game was a bit of an exaggeration. There are a few other things you can do in Shadow of the Colossus. For example, you can hunt lizards with your bow and arrow and eat their tails to increase your stamina meter. Thrilling. Or alternatively, you could shoot fruit down from trees and eat those to increase your health meter. Thrilling. These may seem like minuscule things, and in the case of collecting fruit, it kinda is. You're not gonna find yourself losing tons of health very often in this game. But if you find a lizard, stop what you're doing and get its tail. Because believe me, you'll need all the stamina you can get. All the bosses require that you climb onto them in search of the spot to stab them with your magic glowy sword, and your stamina decreases from both hanging onto the Colossus while it shakes around, or from moving and jumping while you're holding onto a ledge or Colossus. Point is, you're gonna be doing a lot of climbing in this game, so having as much stamina as possible will be very beneficial, especially against some of the bosses later on in the game. Now I will say, while I wasn't bored from overworld traversing, I'm still not the biggest fan of the search part of getting to a Colossus. By lifting your magic glowy sword, beams of light will shine off of it, and when the lights line up, the direction it points is the direction you need to go. Thing is, it points directly at the location of the Colossus, meaning you still have to figure out the route yourself, which itself is fine, but with how big the overworld is, it can be easy to get lost when you have to find a more specific path to follow. Granted, that could be more of a me thing, but then again, this whole review is based around my personal experience, so yeah. Plus, it isn't helped by the fact that Shadow of the Colossus' overworld doesn't have too many distinguished landmarks, so you may find yourself accidentally wandering around. Video games are dumb. But now, it's time to talk about the meat and potatoes of this game, the Colossus battles themselves. The boss fights are more like puzzles than full-on bosses, finding ways to make themselves vulnerable so you can climb onto their body, find their weak spot, and stab it with your magic glowy sword. But it's figuring out how to make them vulnerable where a lot of the challenge comes from. Well, that and trying to stab their weak spot while they desperately shake around, giving you little to no chance to strike. Admittedly, I did find the stabbing process a bit awkward initially, because instead of just holding the button and then letting go to stab like you do with the bow and arrow, you need to hold the button to charge up and then press the button again to stab. Though honestly, I actually grew to really like this method. It makes each stab feel like there's more impact than there probably would have been if you just held the button and then let go. As for the methods of taking down the Colossi, they vary quite a bit and can get pretty creative. The first two bosses, Valus and Quadratus, are both pretty straightforward, with Valus introducing the player to the general mechanics of Colossus fighting, and Quadratus having you fight while riding aggro, something the game does a few times. But after those first two fights is when the game begins to get more creative, requiring you to use pieces of the environment around you to put the battle in your favor, or to use your bow and arrow to exploit exposed part of the Colossus' body. One of my favorite examples of the latter is during the fight against the 10th Colossus, the previously mentioned Dirge. While on the run from it as it tries to consume you, you have to wait until it rises above the sand and then shoot an arrow into its eye. Again, these puzzles can get creative and many times require you to think outside of the box. Though if you are struggling, the voice of Dorman will drop a slight hint that could help you, or just tell you to get to higher ground as you try to figure out how to get to higher ground. Thanks, Dorman, really helpful. You know what, yeah, might as well get to this part now. For a game that's about 95% bosses, there were quite a lot of bosses in this game that I didn't enjoy. Not to say there weren't any I liked. To name a few examples of the battles I enjoyed, there was the 6th Colossus Barba, with you frantically fleeing from it before climbing its majestic beard, the 8th Colossus Kuramori, with you shooting at its legs as it climbs the wall of the Colosseum you're fighting in and hiding as it shoots lightning blasts your way, and my personal favorite boss in the game, the 5th Colossus Avion, a battle that has you climbing onto its wings as it glides past you and climbing around its body while it soars through the area. This is also where the previously mentioned A Despair-Filled Farewell plays, and it suits the battle perfectly. But on the flip side, Shadow the Colossus also has bosses like the 4th Colossus, Phaedra. You're supposed to have Phaedra follow you to a cavern entrance and then retreat into it and come out of a different entrance. So while Phaedra's distracted, you can climb up it from behind. But honestly, getting Phaedra to look down into a cavern felt more like luck to me than skillfully getting it to follow me. That one's a bit of a tamer example, but there's also bosses like the 12th Colossus, Pelagia. Or Pelagia, I have no idea how to pronounce it. A very clunky battle involving you having to swim to its back, which is easier said than done, and then control it by hitting its head teeth pointed in the direction where you want to go so you can reach one of the rooftops, which is where it'll expose its weak spot. Swimming over to its back is tricky enough, but using the head teeth to control feels beyond awkward to do. In fact, the second half of Colossi all feel a lot weaker in general compared to the first half. Case in point, Bassaran, the 9th Colossus. This fight involves you luring Bassaran over to a water geyser and using the blast from the geyser to lift it upward enough to shoot its legs and have it fall over. Except the water needs to hit a certain part of Bassaran's stomach, so the water can very easily just pass through its body and do absolutely nothing. Or my personal favorite, the geyser stopping the water flow just as Bassaran gets over it. It's a fight that doesn't work very well, and it's not helped by one other factor, which brings me to one of the things I disliked the most about this game. So Agro, your horse companion, was designed to control like a real horse. You don't control her directly, but instead you're essentially controlling Wander, who controls Agro with the reins. Thing is, not only does Agro control like riding an actual horse, but she acts like a real horse too. By that I mean she'll occasionally ignore commands and start going her own way. When exploring the overworld, it's perfectly manageable, but in the boss fights where you have to use Agro, it most certainly isn't. For many of these boss fights, you're going to want the camera locked onto the Colossus, which horribly limits your vision while riding Agro, and oh man, having these realistic controls and behaviors during moments like needing to get Bassaran to follow you to a geyser is just really frustrating. Agro is present in 5 bosses, but only needed for 3 of them: Bassaran, Dirge, and the 13th Colossus, Phalanx. I've already gone on about Bassaran, but in the Dirge fight, the camera is your worst enemy here. With Dirge pursuing you most of the fight, you're going to be looking behind you, and for a battle in a more contained area, it's really not helpful to not be able to see if there's a wall or terrain ahead. Phalanx, on the other hand, doesn't have camera issues or even aggro control issues, as most of the fight you're going to be using aggro like you would on the overworld. Now, the problem here is how pointlessly repetitive this fight is. You have to shoot your arrow into all the air sacs on the bottom of its body before riding over it and jumping onto its wing. This wouldn't be a problem, except after you've damaged the weak spot enough, Phalanx will retreat into the sand, forcing you to have to redo the process of shooting the air sacs and climbing its wing again. And it does this twice at the very least. This is a boss I've heard many call the best boss in the entire game, and I'm sorry, but I have to disagree. Also, it's claimed that Phalanx is the most peaceful Colossus, as it's the only Colossus that never attacks you. I beg to differ. Though the title of worst Colossi in the game go to the only 2 not ginormous Colossi, the 11th Colossus Celosia and the 14th Colossus Cenobia. Now both these fights admittedly have pretty interesting first halves. In Celosia's fight, you have to get to knock down a stick that you need to set on fire and use to shoo Celosia away until it falls off the cliffside and breaks its armor. While the first part of Cenobia's fight is a pure platforming challenge, involving getting Cenobia angered enough with arrows to knock down the pillars you stand on so you can continue. But both fights become living nightmares in their second halves, and for the exact same reasons. Reason number 1, these 2 will not stand still. As long as they're running, you're not able to stab their weak spots, and they love to run while you're on their backs. It gets to a point that's not challenging, but just infuriating. And reason number 2, they can stun lock you. Both Colossi are able to ram into you and knock you over, which by the way, Water takes an eternity and a half to get back up when he's knocked over. But the second he's up, before your movement inputs can even be registered, they'll just ram into you again. And they'll do it over and over until they decide to let you go, or if you're lucky, they ram you off an edge. I get that the devs want to be faithful to the original game, but the point of a remake is to make improvements to a game, and a stun lock in 2 different bosses would probably be something they should have thought about not keeping. Now with all that said, there's one more gameplay portion I want to talk about, and that's the final boss. This is a boss I had never heard the end of back in the days of the Countdown community. He showed up on dozens of best final bosses lists. And I'll definitely say this, as mentioned earlier, the scale of this fight is really impressive, and the visual aspect is a treat to the eyes. Not only that, but the music is fittingly somber. You're at the end of your journey, you've just lost your only companion, and you may be feeling at this point that this whole quest wasn't worth it. Unfortunately, all the emotional impact I was supposed to feel from slaying this living fortress faded away really quickly because this fight is honestly not very good. Getting to Malice isn't that bad, but climbing it is where things get messy. Platforms are narrow and easy to fall off of, not helped at all by the gushes of wind that knock you over and could potentially throw you off the Colossus unexpectedly. And following this is a lot of climbing around and jumping that you barely have enough stamina for, and by the time you're on his back and climbing to his head, he decides to just never stop shaking. Not to mention the camera's constantly shifting around, which messes with your movement, and just when I was down to a sliver of his health left but trying to let my stamina recharge, a conveniently placed shoulder-shaking gush of wind had me plummeting back to the very bottom of his body. Needless to say, instead of feeling guilt for killing this majestic creature like the game intended me to, I felt nothing but relief that it was finally over. Now you unlock a bunch of extra stuff after you beat the game for the first time, like a time attack mode and New Game Plus, and apparently playing through time attack will unlock new equipment to enhance abilities or alter your weapon slightly, but frankly, I didn't care. I was done with the game at that point, and I had no interest in playing it anymore. Going into the Shadow of the Colossus remake, I was expecting a game that would give the original a fresh coat of paint and improve on faults within, but I was also hoping that through this, I might gain a new appreciation for the game and finally see it like the thousands who call it one of the greatest games of all time. And I will say, part of that came true. It definitely gives the game that beautiful new coat of paint, and other areas of the game are indeed improved, like with the switchable control schemes. But that said, while I can definitely say I enjoyed the remake more than the original, I still can't say I enjoyed it overall. It had moments I did really like, but the stuff I didn't like really outweighed it for me. Now, this isn't to say I don't understand the appeal behind it, because I definitely do. And not to say I'm going to tell people not to play this game, because it's honestly worth trying at least once. Barring a handful of design choices that I do think are objectively bad, a lot of what I don't like in Shadow of the Colossus is, really at the end of the day, subjective. I may not have been able to get immersed into Wander's journey or get behind some of the design choices, but I can absolutely see why someone would. Except for the stun lock, that's just stupid. So to wrap this review up, if you enjoyed the original Shadow of the Colossus, you'll most likely enjoy the remake just as much, if not more. But if you didn't like the original, chances are the remake won't change your mind. Though then again, nothing's impossible. And if you're going to play Shadow of the Colossus for the first time, I would personally recommend going with the remake over the original, if that option's available to you. This has been Black Mage Maverick, and until the next video, have a nice day everybody.